Hey everyone, I just want to take a moment before we begin. Life is too short, and we often take time for granted. Please, cherish every moment with your loved ones. Treat every second as if it's the last, because we truly never know. A few weeks ago, I lost someone very dear to me. My youngest brother, Tommy. That's why I haven't been active, and I apologize for that. It's been hard processing the fact that 1 minute he was here, happy, healthy, and the next he was gone. But what hurts most is knowing his 19-year-old son, Jade, my nephew, has to go through this loss at such a young age after losing his mom almost 8 years ago. I can't imagine how hard it must be for him. So, if you could, please say a prayer for Jade in the comments. It would mean a lot. Thank you. Now, let's get into today's story. Working night shifts in the respiratory ward of a large hospital somewhere in Northern Europe changes you. After 8 years, I thought I'd seen everything, until last winter, when something happened that made me question my sanity and eventually forced me to transfer to a different hospital entirely. It began on a particularly cold night in December. The ward was unusually quiet, with only 7 patients, 3 of whom were on ventilators. Around 2 a.m., while updating charts at the nurse's station, I heard what sounded like conversation coming from room 237. This caught my attention immediately because the room's only occupant, an elderly man I'll call Mr. Rick, had been on a ventilator for the past week. With a tube down his throat, speech should have been physically impossible. At first, I assumed it was just the television, though we'd shut them all off at midnight as per protocol. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was definitely a voice, deep, raspy, and speaking in what sounded like whispers. When I entered the room, the talking stopped. Mr. Rick was awake, his eyes fixed on the chair beside his bed. The ventilator continued its rhythmic whoosh click, but otherwise the room was silent. I checked his vitals, adjusted his IV, and was about to leave when I heard it again. That whispered voice, coming from somewhere near the bed. I turned back. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. Mr. Rick was staring at me now, his eyes wide with what I initially interpreted as fear. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at the chair beside his bed. The empty chair, or at least it should have been empty. For a fraction of a second, I saw something. A dark mass, vaguely human-shaped, sitting there. I blinked, and it was gone. But the temperature in the room had dropped so dramatically that I could see my breath. Mr. Rick was now frantically scribbling on his communication pad. His message made my blood run cold. "Don't leave me alone with it." I checked the room thoroughly, under the bed, in the bathroom, behind the curtains. Nothing. But the whole time I could feel something watching me. Mr. Rick's eyes followed my every move, silently pleading. I promised to return shortly and hurried to the security office. The guard on duty could tell something was wrong by my expression. When I explained what I'd heard, he agreed to check the cameras. The footage started normally enough. Mr. Rick lying in bed, the empty chair beside him. At exactly 1:47 a.m., something changed. A shadow appeared in the chair, not cast by anything but sitting in it. As we watched, the shadow seemed to lean toward Mr. Rick's bed. That's when we noticed something horrifying. While the shadow was leaning forward, another darker mass was visible through the window, watching from outside. We were on the 7th floor. But what truly chilled me to the bone was what happened when I entered the room in the footage. The shadow didn't disappear or move. Instead, It turned its head, a motion that seemed somehow wrong, too fluid, too far of a rotation for any human neck, and looked directly at the camera. The footage distorted for a moment, and when it cleared, the shadow was gone. I rushed back to room 237, but I was too late. Mr. Rick was in cardiac arrest. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't save him. Time of death, 3:33 a.m. Later, while preparing his body, we found something that still gives me nightmares. On his communication pad, hidden under his pillow, were dozens of pages of frantic writing. Most of it was illegible, but a few phrases stood out. "It comes every night. Not human. Says more will follow. Claims this is its feeding ground. Others can't see it until it's too late." The last message, written in shaky but clear letters, "It wears their faces to gain trust. Don't believe what you see." Over the next few weeks, 3 more patients died in room 237, all during the night shift. All after reporting seeing someone sitting in that chair. Each time the security footage showed the same shadow, and each time that other darker presence watched from outside the window. The hospital eventually closed room 237 for renovations. But the truth is, no one would stay in it. Patients would become hysterical within hours of being placed there, all describing the same thing: a shadow that whispers, that pretends to be loved ones, that feeds on something more vital than life itself. I requested a transfer shortly after the 4th death. The night before I left, I did one final round of the ward. As I passed room 237, I glanced inside through the window. The room was dark, empty, the chair still sitting innocently beside the vacant bed. But in the reflection of the window, I saw it, the shadow, sitting in the chair, looking directly at me. And behind it, pressed against the outside of the window, was that darker mass, its form now clearer than ever. It had too many limbs, too many angles that shouldn't exist in our reality. Both turned to look at me simultaneously. And in that moment, I understood what Mr. Rick's last warning meant. The thing in the chair was just a lure, a puppet used by something far worse, something that had found a way to feed on the vulnerable, the dying, the helpless. I ran all the way to the parking lot, and I never looked back. That was 6 months ago. I work in a different hospital now, in a different city. But sometimes, when I'm doing my rounds late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something sitting in a chair beside a patient's bed. Something that looks like a shadow but isn't. Something that turns its head too far, moves too fluidly, whispers things no human should be able to hear. I've heard rumors from other hospitals now, stories of shadows in chairs, of impossible whispers, of things that shouldn't exist. They're getting more frequent, more bold. So, if you're ever in a hospital at night, and you see someone sitting in a chair beside a patient's bed, look again. It started on what seemed like any other night shift in late September. The ICU was unusually quiet. Only 8 of our 12 beds were occupied. The soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of ventilators created that familiar hospital symphony that had become my nightly soundtrack. Around 2 a.m., my colleague Jenny mentioned something peculiar during our coffee break. "Have you seen that patient wandering the halls?" she asked, stirring her coffee absently. "The woman in the pale blue hospital gown?" I hadn't, but I made a mental note to keep an eye out. Confused patients wandering from their beds wasn't uncommon in the hospital, though it was rare in the ICU, where patients were typically too ill to walk independently. 2 nights later, I saw her myself. I was doing my rounds, checking on Mr. Thompson, not his real name, our post-cardiac surgery patient in room 4, when movement at the end of the hallway caught my eye. Through the dimness, I could make out a figure, a woman in a standard-issue hospital gown, moving slowly along the wall. Her gait was steady but somehow odd, as if her feet weren't quite touching the floor. "Excuse me," I called out, already moving in her direction. "You shouldn't be up. Let me help you back to your room." She didn't respond or turn around. Instead, she continued her slow progress toward the west wing. I quickened my pace. But somehow, despite my brisk walking, I couldn't seem to catch up to her unhurried shuffle. When she reached the corner, she turned left, disappearing from view. By the time I reached the corner, maybe 10 seconds later, the hallway was empty. I checked every room in that wing, spoke to the other nurses on duty, and reviewed our patient list. Every patient was accounted for, and none matched the description of the woman I'd seen. Over the next few weeks, similar reports began circulating among the night staff. Different nurses, on different shifts, all described the same thing: a woman in a hospital gown, always seen from behind, always walking slowly away, always disappearing when followed. Some reported that her gown looked outdated, like the ones used in the hospital decades ago. Others swore they could see through her, but most, like me, saw what appeared to be a solid figure. The day shift never saw her. It became our collective secret, this mysterious wanderer in our halls. We began documenting the sightings in an unofficial log, noting times, locations, and descriptions. A pattern emerged. She appeared most often between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., what we in healthcare call the dead hours. The breaking point came during my shift last week. It was 3:17 a.m., and I was standing at the nurse's station, updating patient charts on the computer. The ICU was eerily quiet that night. Even the usual equipment sounds seemed muffled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that harsh institutional glow that makes everyone look slightly sickly. Movement reflected in the window caught my attention. The large windows that lined our ICU halls offered a perfect mirror in the darkness, and in that reflection, I saw her. The woman was standing directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt her breath on my neck. But I felt nothing. In the reflection, I could finally see her face. Her skin was gray-tinged, her eyes dark hollows, and her lips had a bluish tint that any healthcare worker would recognize as cyanosis, a sign of oxygen deprivation. Her hospital gown was indeed old-fashioned, with ties instead of snaps, and it was stained with something dark that spread across her chest. My heart pounding, I slowly turned around. The space behind me was empty, but when I looked back at the window, she was still there in the reflection, now wearing what I can only describe as a knowing smile. She raised one hand, pointing down the hallway toward room 12. Then the reflection simply faded away, like fog dissipating in sunlight. Shaking, I forced myself to walk to room 12. It was occupied by a young woman who had been admitted earlier that day with severe pneumonia. As I approached the room, monitors suddenly began blaring. The patient was in cardiac arrest. We worked on her for 47 minutes. But despite our best efforts, she didn't make it. Time of death, 4:03 a.m. Later, while helping prepare her body, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She had been changed into an older hospital gown during her stay, one of the few old-style ones still in circulation, with ties instead of snaps. That was when an older nurse, who had worked at the hospital for over 3 decades, shared a story she'd never told before. In 1987, a nurse had died during her shift in the ICU. She had been attacked by a psychiatric patient who had somehow accessed the unit. She was stabbed in the chest and died before help could arrive. She was found, according to the story, in the exact spot where we keep seeing the figure appear. Since that night, I've seen her 4 more times. Each time she appears in the reflection first, and each time she points to a room. And each time, within hours, we lose the patient she indicated. We've started paying very close attention to the patients she points to, implementing additional monitoring and preventive measures. Sometimes we manage to save them. Sometimes we don't. I've struggled with whether to share this story. Who would believe it? How could I explain it? The rational part of my mind still tries to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, coincidence. But I know what I've seen. I know what my colleagues have seen. And I know that sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, in the space between life and death where we do our work, the line between the possible and impossible becomes very thin indeed. I've been a nurse in the intensive care unit for almost 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of deaths. You develop a certain emotional callus in this line of work. You have to, or you'll break. But what happened that night in October 2019 shattered every defense I had built up over my career. It's taken me years to finally write this down, and even now my hands tremble as I type these words. It was during the midnight shift, around 2:30 a.m. The ICU was eerily quiet that night, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hum of ventilators. We had 5 patients, all critical, but Mr. D, I'll call him that, to protect his privacy, was the one we were most concerned about. He had been admitted 3 days earlier with severe pneumonia that had progressed into acute respiratory distress syndrome. His condition had been deteriorating rapidly, despite our best efforts. I remember everything about that night with crystal clarity. The fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows in the corners of the room, the faint antiseptic smell that never quite leaves these spaces, and the sound of my shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor as I made my rounds. Mr. D's vitals had been unstable throughout my shift. His oxygen saturation kept dropping despite being on maximum ventilator support, and his blood pressure was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. I knew, with that intuition you develop after years in critical care, that he probably wouldn't make it through the night. Around 2:45 a.m., I noticed his IV pump was showing a low flow warning. This is routine. Sometimes the lines get kinked, or the catheter needs adjusting. I walked into his room, performing the familiar ritual of donning a fresh pair of gloves. The room was dim, lit only by the monitoring equipment and a small light above the bed. Mr. D appeared to be unconscious, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of the ventilator. I reached for his IV line to check for any obvious kinks or blockages. That's when it happened. The sensation was so real, so physical, that even now, years later, I can feel those hands on my shoulders. They were large, strong hands, definitely a man's hands. The grip was firm but not painful, and the pressure was absolutely unmistakable. In one swift motion, they pulled me backward, away from the bed, with enough force that I stumbled and nearly lost my balance. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, expecting to see one of our security guards or perhaps a doctor who had somehow entered the room without me noticing. But there was no one there. The room was empty, except for Mr. D and me. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the beeping monitors. The air in the room felt different, heavier, colder. I'm not prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but at that moment, every rational explanation seemed inadequate. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Mr. D, who had been unconscious and intubated, was moving. His eyes were open, and he was looking directly at me. This alone was surprising. He hadn't shown any signs of consciousness for the past 24 hours. What happened next haunts me to this day. He raised his hand slightly, just a few inches off the bed, and in a hoarse whisper that somehow cut through the sound of the ventilator, he said, "He doesn't want you near me." His voice was clear, despite tube in his throat, which should have made speech impossible. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I ran. I didn't walk. I ran out of that room as fast as my legs could carry me. I bumped into Karen, another nurse, in the hallway. She took one look at my face and later told me I was as white as a sheet. I managed to stammer out what had happened. Karen, bless her, didn't dismiss my story or try to rationalize it. She just listened, then offered to come with me back to the room. We needed to check on Mr. D. Personal feelings aside, we had a duty of care. When we returned, Mr. D was unconscious again, showing no signs of the alertness he had displayed just moments before. We checked his IV line together. It had indeed been kinked, causing the low flow warning. We fixed it quickly, both of us hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound in that room. An hour later, at 4:03 a.m., Mr. D's heart rate began to drop. We did everything we could, but it was as if something had decided it was his time. He passed away at 4:17 a.m., his death marked by the long, continuous tone of the cardiac monitor. What makes this story even more chilling is what we discovered during the morning shift change. While discussing the night's events with the incoming staff, one of the day nurses, Maria, became visibly shaken. She told us that Mr. D had said something strange to her the day before, during a brief period of lucidity. He had told her that his brother would be coming for him soon. When Maria mentioned that it was good his family would be visiting, Mr. D had shaken his head and whispered, "No, my brother died last year. He's been watching over me." I later learned from his family that Mr. D had indeed lost his brother the previous year, a tall, strong man who had been very protective of Mr. D throughout their lives. They had been extremely close, and on his deathbed, his brother had promised to watch over him always. The logical part of my mind has tried countless times to explain away what happened that night. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the pressure on my shoulders was some sort of muscle spasm. Maybe Mr. D's whispered words were just the random movements of a dying man, and my stressed mind created meaning where there was none. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And in the years since this incident, I've become more attuned to the thin line between life and death that we walk in the ICU. I've noticed other things, subtle things, that I might have dismissed before. The way some patients seem to talk to unseen visitors in their final hours. The inexplicable peace that sometimes settles over a room just before a death. The feeling of being watched when alone with certain patients. I still work in the ICU. I still care for dying patients. But now, when I enter a room late at night, I'm more aware of the possibility that we're not always alone with our patients. Sometimes, I think I feel those hands again, not grabbing or pulling, but present nonetheless. It's no longer frightening, though. Instead, it serves as a reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain, forces we can't understand. I've never told this story publicly before. My colleagues who were there that night don't talk about it either, but sometimes we exchange knowing looks when similar incidents occur. We've learned to respect the mysteries that surround death and dying, to acknowledge that science and medicine don't have all the answers. To this day, I sometimes wonder about those unseen hands. Were they simply a brother keeping his promise to watch over his sibling? Or was it something else entirely, something from beyond the veil that separates our world from whatever lies beyond? I don't expect to ever have answers to these questions, but I know that my experience that night changed me forever. It taught me that death isn't always the cold, clinical event we learn about in medical school. Sometimes it's a doorway, and sometimes, just sometimes, someone might be waiting on the other side. If you're still watching this, congratulations. That means you haven't looked over your shoulder yet. But before we continue, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who thinks they can handle it, and subscribe. Because, trust me, the scariest stories are yet to come. And you wouldn't want to be alone when they do, would you? There are things you don't forget in this job. Patients come and go. Some leave on their own 2 feet. Others in body bags. You learn to cope. You learn to tell yourself that it's just another shift, another name on a chart, another heartbeat on a monitor. But every once in a while, something happens that lingers, something you can't explain. I've been an ICU nurse for over a decade, working in hospitals across North America. I've seen a lot. Miracles, tragedies, everything in between. I tell myself I don't scare easy, but there was one patient, one night, that still haunts me. His name was Daniel, mid-60s, a retired school teacher. Came in after a mild heart attack. Nothing too serious. He was stable, responding well to treatment, and scheduled to be transferred to a regular floor the next morning. By all accounts, Daniel was going to be fine. At least, that's what we thought. I remember that night shift well. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you nervous. The ICU isn't supposed to be silent. There's always something happening. Monitors beeping, staff moving, patients moaning. But that night, there was an unnatural stillness to everything, like the whole floor was holding its breath. Around 11:30 p.m., I did my rounds and stopped by Daniel's room. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. His vitals looked good. Blood pressure steady. Heart rate normal. He should have been sleeping, but something about his posture felt off. "You doing okay, Daniel?" I asked, adjusting the blankets around him. His eyes flicked toward me, and that's when I saw it. Fear. Not the usual kind of anxiety patients get before a procedure. This was different. Deep. Primal. Like he knew something I didn't. He swallowed hard and reached for my hand. His grip was weak, but urgent. "I'm going to die at 3:06 a.m. I almost laughed, not because I thought it was funny, but because I thought he was joking. Patients say all kinds of strange things when they're under stress. It's common, especially at night. "Come on, Daniel," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "You're stable. Your EKG looks great. You're heading to a step-down unit tomorrow morning." But he didn't let go. "Please," he whispered. "Don't leave me alone." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I pulled a chair next to his bed. "I'll be right here," I reassured him. "Try to rest." For the next few hours, I stayed close, checking in between rounds. He didn't sleep. Every time I looked over, his eyes were open, locked on the clock above the door, watching the numbers change. 1:58 a.m., 2:34 a.m., 2:55 a.m., As 3 a.m. approached, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. I reminded myself it was just a coincidence. Daniel was anxious. Nothing more. Then at 3:05 a.m., he sat up suddenly, gasping. His fingers dug into the sheets. His breathing turned ragged. The heart monitor started beeping erratically. I stood quickly, pressing the call button. "Daniel, what's wrong?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. His pupils dilated. A single tear rolled down his cheek. And then, 3:06 a.m., a long, flat beep filled the room. His heart stopped. The code team rushed in. We did everything. CPR, epinephrine, defibrillation. Nothing worked. He was gone, exactly when he said he would die. I stood there in stunned silence as the doctor called the time of death. My hands were still pressed against his unmoving chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was fine. He was supposed to be discharged in the morning. There was no medical reason for this. No warning signs. No logical explanation. I stepped back, staring at his lifeless face, and felt a chill crawl up my spine. Did he know? A few days later, I checked the autopsy report. Cause of death, unknown. I read it again. No heart failure. No stroke. Nothing. I felt sick. I asked one of the doctors if this was possible, if a man could just know when he was going to die. The doctor shrugged, saying sometimes people just let go. But Daniel didn't let go. He fought. He was terrified. So why did he die? I started thinking about his words. I'm going to die at 3:06 a.m. Why 3:06? Why not 3:05 or 3:10? Why that exact minute? I couldn't shake it. I asked around, talked to other nurses who had worked in that ICU longer than I had. That's when I learned something that made my stomach drop. Daniel wasn't the first. A few months before, another patient, an elderly woman, had told a nurse the exact same thing. Same words. Same time. She died at 3:06 a.m. And before that, another man. Different illness. Different case. But same time of death. No one had connected the dots. No one wanted to. It was just one of those things that people didn't talk about. I looked through the records. My hands trembled as I went further back. Every few months, a patient in that same room predicted their death. Every single one at 3:06 a.m. I don't work night shifts anymore, and I never step foot in that room.